to get deeper into actual writing, and I think all of you have done in your writing is inhabited your cities with characters who have more nuanced perspectives on the cities that they're living in. Just based on the fact that you are writers and you have the benefit of time to convey exactly what you want to convey with your cities. So, Fonda, we'll start with you. I'm curious, why did you decide to choose a city as a setting to begin with? And then building on top of that, how does it play into how you portray things like world building and character and plot?
So, really, for me, the reason why my trilogy is set in a city is because of vibes. Like when I started writing the Green Bone Saga, I didn't have a plot, I didn't have characters, I just had vibes. I just knew what this story would feel like. And I envisioned it as being kind of a modern era fantasy that evoked the like coolest moves in the martial arts movies that I enjoyed, but also a lot of gangster fiction and crime drama movies. And what is that genre without the men smoking in bars and the back alley deals and the assassinations at the docks, and like those are just so much a part of the aesthetic of that genre that I knew right off the bat that this would be a story set in a city, and that the city would play an incredibly important role in the narrative. And my goal right off the start was that the city of Janloon had to be a character in its own right. You had to get to know the city in the same way that you get to know the characters, because it is, even though the trilogy goes off into a bunch of other places and you go to other countries, you go to other cities, and it becomes much more global, it always comes back to the city of Janloon. And in order to make that character, the Uber character of Janloon, feel real, I needed to make it as textural as possible. So I focused a lot on making it feel lived in and making it feel specific, giving names to the districts and the streets, the restaurants, the cars that you see on when you're walking down the sidewalk. All the smells and the sights and all of that had to be part of the story. And you talked about having different experiences for different people who live in a city. And I accomplished that because of a minor character. I have a cast of characters that you see throughout the trilogy, but most of them are members of the ruling clan of the city, and so they have a certain perspective of it. And early on, I had this minor character who showed up that I initially intended as a framing device. He would come on like a George R. R. Martin style character and get us into the world and then die. And that was kind of my initial intent with this character. But as he walked on to the page, I realized, no, this guy is super useful to me as a writer, because he has a completely different perspective about life in this city and shows you the seedy underbelly and the like sort of desperate life of a character who does not have wealth and power in the city. And as a result, he could get me into parts of Janloon that the main characters don't see as often and aren't a part of. And so having a multi POV cast was really useful to understand the city and the setting better, as was just making it feel lived in. And I love talking about world building. It's kind of one of my favorite craft topics. And I often talk about how a lot of world building is just having your characters live in the world. And as they're moving through the narrative and advancing the plot, I had characters have a tense confrontation in a temple, or have a family, conversation at a sporting event. And a lot of the care of these characters discussions and strategy happen in their favorite family restaurant. Right. So all of those things I hope contribute to making the city feel like this, not just a backdrop, but like an actual character in the trilogy.
Yeah, and I like the way that you frame that. It's like the city and the scenes themselves are a framing device for world building, plot, and character. On uh, writing excuses, the podcast, you had an intensive world building kind of course with them, where you describe it as the narrative holy trinity of world building, plot, and character, and how all these things play off of each other. And I think you can use the city itself as a framing device for the world building, depending on where you set your scenes, depending on how your characters interact with those scenes, those scenarios. And then on top of that, what are those characters doing there? And how do they perceive the world? And how do they drive the plot forward based on where they are and what they're doing? And so it's like all these three things come together and allow you to create something more rich and cohesive. And I think all four of you do a great job of setting your scenes in such ways that your characters can play off of it. There's this nice back and forth interaction between your characters and the world, such that they enhance each other. The world feels richer for what the character sees it as, and the character is richer for what the world they inhabit allows them to be. And so I really, really love how you frame that, just as the narrative holy trinity in these three things working in
If I can
conjunction.
just add one thing about
Yeah.
the city as a setting and as a character, is that oftentimes you can make your city, whether it's you're using a real city or a fictional city, thematically resonant with the story, because it would have been a very different story if I had set the Green Bone Saga in, I don't know, a rural mining town. I mean, I could have had Magic Jade in a rural mining town, but it would have been completely different. And one of the reasons why John Loon is such an integral part of the story is that one of the major themes of the trilogy is globalization and modernization, and that tension between modernity and tradition among these characters, and the culture that they that they are part of that legacy of these cultural traditions, and yet they are also having to deal with foreign influences that are coming into their city. And cities are so often, the focal point of influences from outside as well. So the thematic resonance of modernization and like moving into, into being part of the world and opening up and trade, all of those things are also part of the city and make that like a resonant setting.
Hmm. And JD, in your case with Monkey Around, I'm curious how you came to decide, I want to set this story in San Francisco. But on the notion of thematic resonance, I think that's really cool. Your version of San Francisco resonates the story that you're putting on the page, in the sense that we brought up shapeshifting earlier. I did, in the sense of Berlin. Your version of San Francisco involves shapeshifting magical creatures and characters in a version of San Francisco that is riding out the monumental change and fallout from the 2008 stock market crash. And so I think it's really cool that you have this thematic resonance between your characters and your version of San Francisco. So how did you decide to set it in that city, and what was your process like in terms of fleshing out the characters and the world building and all of that?
Um, well, I was reading a lot of urban fantasy at the time, a lot of woman-centered paranormal detective stories, and I just decided I wanted to write one. And as soon as I decided I wanted to write one, it was really obvious I wanted to set it in San Francisco. One of the things, and I don't get me wrong, I love urban fantasy and I love all of these series that I was reading. One of the things that bothered me about it was that the genre is very, very white, and it's very, very focused on European mythology, particularly vampires, werewolves, and fae, and there's so much more mythology out there that could be tapped for urban fantasy. So I just decided to set it in my San Francisco. I mean, the San Francisco, the Bay Area that you see depicted in Monkey Around is where I live. The layers of culture and subculture that you see in there are my layers, the layers that I live in and that my friends live in and that I function in. And I wanted for once in my life to actually see my world represented in literature. It's pretty much that simple. You know, and your theme today is characters as cities. I decided to make the Bay Area an actual character, not just like a character, but an actual character. The Bay Area has a genius loci, the spirit of the place that actually at one point in the story rises up and more or less communicates with the main character. And it was something like what Fonda said earlier about how cities tell themselves what they are. I actually decided to have my, and what I was talking about earlier with Berlin renaming its streets, you know, Berlin street renaming is one of Berlin's particular ways of telling itself what it wants to be. For me in San Francisco, it's collective action. And so I wanted to have the city rise up and choose a leader of collective action to communicate with and say, this is who I want to be, make it happen, you know. And it literally happens in the book. It's the region rises up as a spirit and says, this is what I want you to make me. And it was very important to me that this person be not just a leader of collective action, but a woman of color, an Asian American woman who is working in social justice communities, particularly in her own Asian American social justice community, because that is my experience of the Bay Area. It's my experience in San Francisco. And I think I've lost track of your question. I just went off on my own hobby horse.
No, you are on a perfect track there. You've touched on a lot of it, is sort of how you're balancing world building with character and the reasons why you set it in San Francisco, but
shapeshifters.
I love it.
You brought up the shapeshifters. I wanted to say something to that. One of the things about and this appears throughout the book, I forefront particularly the Asian American and the Latinx communities in San Francisco in the book. And one of the things about these two communities, about all communities of color, all immigrant communities especially, but all communities of color in the United States, is that there is a lot of code switching that has to happen. And for those of you who don't know what code switching means, it literally is a linguistic term that means switching from one language to another. But in the United States, it's been taken as more of a metaphorical term for switching from one language, one dialect, one subcultural idiom to another, when you're speaking to different subdialects of English. And so immigrant communities in the United States and in San Francisco especially have to code switch constantly. When they're within their community, they speak and behave one way. When they're outside of their community, they speak and behave another way. And with Asian American activism, because you're not just in your own community, your own ethnic community, you're in a broader pan-ethnic community where a lot of people from a lot of different cultural origins have come together, you know, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Filipino, South Asian, et cetera, and they all have different uses, they all have different languages. So even when you're within your own community, you have to code switch, do a lot of code switching. So I forefronted shapeshifters in this story because these are people who in their daily lives are constantly shapeshifting, even in their human lives are constantly shapeshifting. And the two main Asian American characters are unlimited shapeshifters. They're not just stuck, restricted to one form. They could take on any form because within their own communities, they have to do a lot of different types of code switching as well. So that was something that, you know, once I settled on that, I gave the entire book the theme of transformation, because I wanted to basically just, you kind of lay that on top of the book and the metaphors just write themselves. basically. It's not super hard to create thematic resonance when you lay the right metaphor over the top of your story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's fascinating. I mean, for me, now that I live in Ecuador, that that code switching thing you brought up, I think it goes beyond just America in terms of its modern connotations, because here I experienced so many different sides of Ecuador, and even within Spanish, it's like my in-laws, they're from rural Ecuador, and when we go back, the way that they speak kind of shifts a little bit, and the way that they pronounce certain things, we would call it, in North America, it's like, oh, you're from the boonies, or you're like a redneck or something like that, but it's like redneck Ecuadorians and how they speak Spanish in a different way that people in the city in Quito or Guayaquil would say, oh, you're a little more like uneducated, you know what I mean, just by listening to how they speak. And so it's really fascinating, like these sub communities within larger communities, and how language, even though it's, a blanket term, can be so multi-layered and so distinct depending on where you are and who you're speaking with, whether it's in English or whether it's in Spanish, and all these different communities just smashing together. And Gareth, in your case, I want to toss the same question to you about how you chose to set your books in a city, but you also have fantastical races like ghouls and a disease that sweeps through the city called I can't remember what it's called, but the stone men, who are yeah, exactly. And so you have this this dynamic of interaction between people based on what form they take, whether if you have stone flesh or you're a ghoul or you're a human or whatever strata of economic status, etc. So if you want to jump off on that.
I mean, I didn't sort of consciously set out going, oh, well, put this in a city. When I started the book, I had absolutely no idea what I was doing or where I was running. So I sort of threw out lots of ideas, and then sort of took a step back and said, okay, here's how these can all fit together. Which I think is actually a fairly good way to think about writing a novel in a fictional city. Because with very, very few examples, no one sort of sits down and sort of creates a city from scratch. They're things that accrete, that evolve over time. But when you experience them, you sort of you come to you sort of get cross sections to them. You see cities present and bits of different pasts. This building is from this particular era. This particular group arrived this city 100 years ago. These are the newcomers and so forth. So you get a sort of different slice of the city each time. So basically, when it comes to writing is sort of throwing ideas out there and then finding the most parsimonious way to put them together, fitted with city building, as opposed to starting from scratch and going, right, here's the timeline of the city from day one.
And how did that work for you in terms of giving you a platform through which you could flesh out the characters and the plot and world building and stuff like that?
Well, a lot of the time, I would write something. Oh, that's really interesting. I wonder where that goes. And create a new character to basically follow that thread. So the book starts off with 3 thieves, and then I would I want to go get into the politics a bit more. There's this character created who's a detective. I'll have a point of view character from point of view chapter from him. He can go off talk to people at a higher socioeconomic class and learn about how these cities upper class functions, and then the university an academic, and they can go off and see that sort of stuff. It was very much sort of following interesting threads, and then you can sort of look back and see again a different perspective of the city that you've traversed.
Yeah, it just creates a dynamic perception of what the city is like. You see it from the upper echelons all the way down to the bottom and the dregs, and I love that your process was so spontaneous. It's like after reading your books, it's interesting to apply that knowledge to, oh yeah, this character came into the story, and I can just see your thought process is soon after that there was a POV chapter from their perspective, and I'm like, cool, because I really wanted to learn what the story was like from their perspective, and that's exactly the mindset that you had.
Yeah, I mean, again, the whole point of a city is that there's so much there all clashing into like overlapping, clashing. It's fun to go exploring and find interesting nooks and crannies.
Yeah, I agree completely. And Peter, at what point did you decide you wanted to set your stories in a city? And I know a lot of your foundation came from tabletop RPG that you created. So just jump off on that and tell us how you did it.
Well, using New York City as Empire City, it's a cheat and a conceit, right? New Yorkers think that they're the center of the universe, so it's very easy to gravitate towards writing a story with that as the center of the universe. My Guardian of Empire City series is based on a series of tabletop RPGs that I've been running with my gaming group, who I've known since 1989. Fabulous people, very creative. And it's a collaborative effort because I came up with a concept of, hey, let's have a group of people who are specialists that can solve crimes strange and unusual by any means necessary. And we'll throw in urban fantasy, and we'll throw in science fiction, and we'll throw in fantasy and a lot of bad jokes, and we'll mesh that all together into what eventually became completed games that I then took those games and said, hey, let's novelize those. So I did. And, the characters, most of the characters in the story are actually characters or mirror images of the characters that some of my players played, with the exception of the lead character who I came up with myself. And so, I wanted to have a setting that was both familiar and unfamiliar. It's a near future New York, which it's partly a conceit because by using New York City, I don't have to create a city. It's already there. What I can do is take the foundation of what's there and then change it and go, what if? What if this happened? What if this neighborhood's changed? Why did this neighborhood change? Who lives in this neighborhood? Ooh, maybe it's stayed the same over the years, but what are the subtle influences? And you get to play with that. And so the sandbox becomes very broad and very approachable. So again, using New York City, I focused on in the first book, I focused on Manhattan for the main thrust of the story, but the lead character is from an area called Brighton Beach, because I wanted to bring in an aspect of the character that he's half Jewish, and I don't see, in reading a lot of urban fantasy, I don't see Judaism really show up much in these stories, and that's okay. It's just hasn't been there. But I wanted to bring my own slant to it. I'm a Jewish family. In fact, my son a year ago today was bar mitzvahed. I got another one coming up in November. And I wanted to add that bit of cultural difference and distinction to my stories, in addition to, like what Jadie said. I mean, the preponderance of the stories that I read as well, it's very Euro mythology focused. It's mostly white, and to be fair, my lead characters are white, but have their distinctions as well. Just try to create a bigger world and remind people that there is a greater and bigger world out there, to perhaps shed some light on some bits of culture that you don't normally read about or don't normally see. And that becomes even more apparent in the sequel pieces of 8. New York is wonderful because it's so big and so sprawling that you go. I can go to familiar areas and then change them, and use street names to lend the familiarity to it, to give it a sense of place and history, but then change it and say, oh, well, what used to be here, the old brownstones and up and comers and art decor and whatever, is now run down and economically depressed. Whereas I can flip that and take economically depressed areas and change them and do whatever I want with it to show a future that is familiar and yet different.